Flagship Changes. 1.
I never came close to replicating the musical piece of all pieces. I know that now for sure. Never a single correct phrase. Some of us fellas who were there that night, those of us still around, have shamelessly gotten together from time to time, motivated and gullibly reassured that a few more hours of collaboration would yield the secret. But none of us could ever agree on a thing. Nothing. Imagine that. Among a group of seasoned pros, all our collective musical prowess, with enough ear training between us to account for 10 lifetimes, amounted to precisely shit. Frustration always ended the collaborative efforts within an hour, and only served to put taut strains on old shaky friendships. I never saw any of those guys again, but I'm sure they remained just as bitter and apathetic as I did. In all honesty, nothing good had ever come of it. Hearing the mystical symphony had only given me stress, anger, and disillusionment. Only the experience itself was retained. The music, the feeling. If I could live it all again, even knowing everything now, I think I'd still choose to hear it, for it was truly mesmerizing. I certainly can't imagine ever refusing, and still would pity any version of myself who could. In March of 1951, I first heard it, and scarcely a moment thereafter ever went by without the thought of it re-emerging. Nothing was the same for me after that night. I was cast into a dull and sheenless world when the villainous pianist, Alice Finger's Relic, unleashed his audible evil in Philadelphia, though supremely beautiful it was. Beautiful. Regarding art of this heavenly sort, the word beautiful encapsulates the vast insufficiency of language. God, how can I describe the indescribable? How can one ever articulate paradise with mere words? That night, the music echoing in that old dance hall was glorious and gutting, utterly original and arresting. I experienced the moment entirely entranced in shock and awe. It was the great binding and loosing of souls. The piece was infinite pain by way of absolute pleasure. It was the hangman's ornately braided noose, so lavish that those condemned turn impatient to feel the rope upon their soft throats. Authentic joy gushes free from within as it tightens around their necks and snuffs out the soul. Once unbound, whatever it was proved to be the dagger that filleted my life's passion and tolled the death knell of my music career. It wouldn't be until decades later, when Finger's Relic finally died, that I would be given a chance to rouse my long-suffocated soul to those heights once more.
2.
I wasn't the only one there, of course. Many of the Philly greats were at the Zanzibar that night, 3/5 of the Flagship alone. They saw it too. Surely they heard something. And the following sunrise found us all among the greats no longer. We were reduced to mere shells of our former selves, men who had once been publicly revered and lauded as musical prodigies, genius players who were truly imbued with innovation and brash artistry. We were the best around, the Flagship. The Flagship was basically a top-tier quintet, kind of like a citywide all-star band. We were the 5 musicians who represented the best of Philly, and we showed the city what it meant to play in the pocket. National acts would often run their tours through Philly's clubs and venues, and the close-fisted record labels funding them, rather than enduring the expenses of the main act's typical supporting band, would instead hire the strongest local players for accompaniment. The go-between for these coveted gigs was a longtime Philly booking agent named Juan Hector Rojas. We called him Cookie. The guy was a square, but he was all right. He was a failed flugelhornist who maintained relevance only for those lofty national connections he had made. These ties propelled Rojas in his managerial career and ultimately granted him final say over the members of the Flagship. It was mostly on the level, though. Guys would battle it out at the Z-Bar in those days, and Cookie Rojas let the playing speak for itself. To the dismay of Ellis Relic, I had steadily fattened my purse and led the Flagship from behind the piano for over 6 years before that night. Yet afterward, I'm afraid there was no longer a single innovative note left in all of my catalog. I had once been Willie the goddamn Air, but Christ, the absolute piss I produced while woefully seated at the piano after that night. I swear I could feel the spirit of Big King Will turning in his grave. In humiliation, I sought the solace of sparing the living and the dead from the remnants of my once considerable talents. No one bothered thanking me, but you're welcome.
3.
I have mentioned my pedestrian attempts at figuring out the metaphysical musical piece by memory. Of course, our sessions at the Z-Bar that night were being recorded, just as they always were. Such musical heroics were so common at the Zanzibar in those days that 2 Philly jazz stations had set up shop in the club and recorded every sound produced in that joint. Yet on that night, for the first time in years, both recording boards failed just as Fingers began. Afterward, the late-night crowd, incensed by the dramatic and singular performance, almost at once began clamoring for the recordings, but were crushed by the apparent malfunction. Many in the crowd took the news and the performance itself as overwhelming and emotionally paralyzing. Some fainted, and they wept in droves. Relic, too, was all shaken up when he finished. He appeared to not be able to hold his head up, and was so drunk or dazed that he nearly passed out coming off stage. When the whole scene regained a bit of composure and sanity, they pressed Ellis about what he had played. He stayed mostly quiet, though, and wouldn't give the crowd much. Finally, someone shouted, $100 to play it for us again, Fingers." "Christ, no, let it be over," Relic said with disgust. "It exists, for better or worse. Let that be enough. And may it ease the torment of my dark lineage." A strange grin flashed on his face and instantly dissipated. "And it does exist, doesn't it? And God, how stellar. What timeless beauty. And no one may play it again. No one may call on it. It's mine. And it was for this night alone. It'll be on me, Ellis Fingers Relic. Not Monk, Bud, or Willie the Air. But don't ask me for a reprise. I couldn't replay it or scroll out even a single measure if you offered me $1,000,000. There are no notes to write, no directions to follow. It was you, your heart's desires. The pyramids merely gifted you a free write on the piano." "What'd you call it?" someone shouted in the crowd. "Pyramids?" "A free write," Relic said, cutting him off. "That's what my treacherous grandfather always said, always told me. He would repeat it incessantly after dementia finally spoiled his mind. He'd stare at me through milk eyes and say, 'A free write, you hear? Nothing more, boy, but using pitch and pace in lieu of pen and parchment.'" Fingers messed up his face a bit to imitate his grandfather. Then, just after, his grin returned, and this time stayed put. "I know this won't mean a thing to any of you, but tonight I played the pyramids perfectly for the first time in my life. Right now, those words will reach your ears in vain, but what they represent, no one here shall ever forget. As for what came after, it was none of my design. The rest was you." Next, Relic briskly exited his stunned silent room through the crash bar fire doors in the back of the club. He wandered off into the misty haze of the night, and by all accounts, he was never spotted anywhere in town again. His family home in Old City quickly fell into disrepair, and Ellis vanished, was just gone. Everyone expected the swift news of Relic's demise and wondered if the evil of his looming ghost would soon appear. But nothing ever came. It would be another 20 years until Fingers truly became a hostile revenant, a foul ghost loose in the spirit realm. Yet I feared, even after all those years, he'd still set his vile sights on me. I say again, I came to view the music that shattered my entire reality as utterly unattainable. After years of futile attempts, I gave up on that quest. I came to regard my memory of it as less than reliable, and I thought so be it. I was barely bothered by it anymore. I suppose it was a small gift. No, in those days I was haunted by the last musical phrases that penetrated my ears prior to that supernal movement, what Relic called the pyramids. For while it was a bizarre mixture of craft and chaos, it was infinitely easier to recall. It featured an array of diminished triads arpeggiated in whole tone phrasing, and was flecked with dashes of chromaticism and wild leaps of interval. Adding to all this was the most extraordinary and counterintuitive rhythmic pattern that's ever come upon me, overtook me. It was four measures of alien music that were astonishing in their own right, and this, only just the precursor to perfection, merely the primer before the paragon. But that was the piece of sheet music that strangely appeared at my doorstep on what was my final night. It was on the same stormy night that Relic croaked, you see. Only hours later the dark box arrived. It seemed that while the demonated artist was breathing his last, he decided that without a son or family heir of his own, he'd will his most prized musical possession to me, the next best heir, his longtime superior and rival.
5.
Before rising to fame and infamy, Relic's fledgling music career was already littered with peculiarities. First off, he traveled and regularly performed with an unknown ragtag band of ghouls. They could play, but each one was more hideous than the last. His bass player, who Relic only referred to as Stretch, literally looked like a half-dead Frankenstein, his squared head slouched over on stage as he played his double bass. I never heard any of them speak a single word. It was as if Ellis was their owner and spoke for them. Relic often performed for hours on stage with a twisted grin tattooed and unchanged on his gaunt face. He and his Creepshow band seemed to never tire. No less strange, Ellis would lead his band in a prayer with a ritualistic drink and libation prior to their shows. 5 shots of absinthe were always requested from the bar, to which Fingers added 1 drop of thick red ooze from a worn leather flask he concealed in his breast pocket. The bars never loved Relic's crew or his weird tendencies. The most irredeemable act Fingers was detestably known for was the bird. One night at the Z-Bar, Relic and his unsightly band were particularly hot. Ellis was honestly ripping the roof off the joint, and all with that immovable plastic expression on his face like a mask. During the third tune, as Ellis took a solo before the coda, a majestic raven rose above the crowd, gliding to the stage from the back of the club. The imagery was so far on the nose that I swore it was some lame part of Relic's act. I mean, a ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore, soaring right up to the most occult musician that's ever lived? But suddenly, in the next moment, the bird viciously attacked Ellis, pecking at his face and cawing yelps of war and madness. Fingers endured a short but real punishment from that raven, yet remained totally unmoved. He absorbed the thrashing with the reaction of a corpse. Then, with sharp dexterity, Relic abruptly snatched the bird out of the air with his left hand while his right never stopped ad-libbing on the piano. He caught the fowl by its throat while simultaneously directing his undead-looking band to continue. "Tag the changes," Fingers commanded. His face leaked from the severe wounds of beak and talon as Relic calmly turned toward the back of the stage and violently stuffed the large bird's twitching body into his fishbowl-styled tip jar. His band never missed a beat and vamped on as Ellis closed the attached lid tight. In the next instant, Fingers returned to playing as if nothing had occurred. He restored his unnerving and frozen visage as before, but now with the crimson addition of his uncleared and leaking wounds. Relic bled, the crowd gasped, and all the monsters in the band grinned hideously. Needless to say, they brought the house down during their finale. If all that wasn't odd enough, for the next year straight, Fingers routinely prepped for his shows by cracking open that sealed jar and huffing the fumes of the raven's trapped corpse, weeks and months dead and decaying. In the time leading up to the unforgettable night, Relic was seldom seen without his darkening putrid glass jar in tow. The stench, even through the fastened lid, was almost unbearable. But Fingers could be induced, neither by threat nor by plea, to throw off this disgusting and macabre practice, this habitual need of his.
6.
A couple of the boys came to me one night, pressing me as someone Relic looked up to and a fellow pianist to try talking some sense into the unhinged musician. The whole thing made my damn stomach turn, but it talked me into it. I made my way to the backstage area of the Z-Bar and found Fingers alone in the green room. He was cradling the black jar and...
Missing section.
Really set the world on fire, Will, Fingers said with thick sarcasm. Climbed all the way to the top of the big leagues. All the way to the deepest pocket of the Philly jazz scene. The Flagship. Maybe Cookie Rojas will put you up for accompanying play of the year. A crowning achievement, really. The king might have actually been proud of you, huh? But probably not. The old king was never quite doting on his baby boy, was he? But let me ask you, Will, whatever happened to your band? Haven't seen a flyer in quite some time. You're so concerned about my well-being, questioning my darkness. But what about you, Will? Why are you still so clad in darkness? Still cloaked in the massive shadow of your big, bad, dead daddy? Big King Will left us over 10 years ago, yeah? But you're still just Willie the Heir. Christ, what the fuck do you know about darkness? When are you finally gonna rise up, Eric?
Missing section.
Left the noxious fumes of that room so livid I was shaking. I was more convinced than ever of Relic's insanity. I'd certainly thrown in the towel on possibly helping Fingers at that moment. And I was not alone. Ellis Relic lost a ton of work because of those regrettable oddities in the months leading up to their March 11th show. Fingers became a pariah. Half of the city of brotherly love was disgusted by his deranged lunacy, while the other half intensely feared him. Largely cast aside, Ellis became further introverted and isolated in his gloomy ancestral home on Delancey Street in Old City. A house of horrors, no doubt. The Relics were known to travel down the darkest of roads. Ellis surely did in those final months. He'd lost it. Detached from reality, his mind recoiled into the recesses of his dark inherited dispositions. And he took us all with him. All the poor souls there at the Z-Bar that night were gifted an impossible glimpse of the heavens, and thereby we all found hell.
7.
On the night I made my ascent, I hadn't seen or heard from Ellis Relic in almost 20 years. Amid the storming darkness, I could have sworn I'd heard a single knock on my front door at around 3 in the morning. I was awake but was unconvinced. I didn't immediately check. But some minutes later, I threw an eye up to the peephole, and that's when I first saw what had been left for me. A dark wooden box. I knew instantly that it came from Fingers. Now, I'm tempted merely to plow ahead, but I would truly be remiss not to mention just once the lavish decadence of the handcrafted hexagonal box. It was tediously scorched and burned on all sides in etches of vast and ancient battle scenes. Quite detailed and gory, in fact. It was stellar, loved and crafted with what can only be described as a Lovecraftian ghoulish grace. The artistry upon the lid of the box depicted a large crowd, cloaked, hooded, and bowing in worship to a great pyramid. I suddenly felt a tinge of panic, and for the first time, I glanced up from the chthonic box and scanned the street from my doorway. There was nothing to be seen, but I knew something was watching. I could feel its gaze like never before. Something needed to make sure that I accepted Ellis's bequest, and by doing so, my fate in this tale. With a physical shiver, I brought the box inside and locked the door. In the front room, I unfastened the brass clasps on the wooden lid and opened the box to find a small piece of parchment laying within, glowering back at me as if I'd disturbed its slumber. God, it looked old. I'm no expert, but I'd say it was thousands of years old. Across the top was written, O tempus tuum pyramidum, O time thy pyramids. The pyramids, I thought. The title was followed by a 4-measure aria, written in classical grand staff and in line with all the idiosyncrasies found in ancient chamber music of the old world. It must have been from the very advent of composition, of music, of history, time. The ink was still pitch black on the crackling vellum. What is this evil? I want no part of your dark games, Relic. I'll never play it.
8.
Attached to the inside of the lid was a wax-sealed envelope which pronounced in dark calligraphy, Mr. William Candler Harriot VIII. While breaking the seal, I felt another chill cut through me like in the doorway, and just then, bang! I heard a similar noise as I did before, this time on the front window, and this time louder, undeniable. I was already shaken up by the arrival of the box, and I nearly jumped out of my skin at the startling thud. In a fog, I clenched my eyes shut and spent a short time trying to convince myself that I was just hearing things. I had been cursed by the actions of Ellis Relic for nearly 20 years. He had taken everything from me, stripped me of the music, the only thing I'd ever truly loved. Hadn't I suffered enough? Racked in fear, I intensely tried to wish it all away, but it was no good. I set the unopened envelope down while drowning in anxiety, slipped my feet into some bed shoes, and nervously shot out the front door to investigate. Outside, on the lawn, a large dead falcon was slumped on the grass under my window. I was instantly stunned by the size of this creature. The thing's sprawled out wingspan was tremendous. Its head was crushed and ground to a nub, gone. The bird appeared to have, full speed, flown directly into my bay window. I instantly thought of Relic's putrid raven and vomited on the ground. That sickness was arresting, thick and repulsive, and black as that evil raven's dark plumage. As I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, my downcast eyes shifted back to the falcon. I was horrified to see that the bird's miserable form was somehow replaced with the grisly, decapitated head of Ellis Fingers' Relic. Besides the lack of body, Fingers looked just like he did that night 20 years before. His bloody, sawn-off face was fixed into that same leering grin as when he performed. But it was his eyes. His burning eyes gripped my soul with darkness, and thunder-stricken, I shrieked in terror. Then I saw a jarring blackness rise up and slam into my world. It seemed to barrow into me with the force of 1,000,000 molten moons, but made not even the slightest whisper.
9.
The next thing I knew, I awoke, lying beside the dead falcon, face down in a pool of my own dark bile. The front door was still open, and I had no idea how long I'd been out. I was suddenly lifted to my feet. With no intent or agency of my own, I was chauffeured through my front yard by some invisible force. I looked down and marveled at the tips of my slippers grazing the grass upon which I floated, and noticed several new dead birds also strewn out on the lawn. The sky was speckled twilight lavender amidst the incipient sunrise as I reached the doorway. A beam of light cracked through the clouds and illuminated my front room. Relic's letter to me, now removed from its envelope, was slowly unfolding of its own accord upon the table. I saw even from a distance that it simply read, "Arise, Willie the Heir." Then I saw it, propped up on the music stand of my father's old spinet piano, which adorned the front room ever since his own father bought it for him at the turn of the century. The piece finally caught the glint of morning and gleamed forth. The pyramid sat perched at the piano's pinnacle, pleading to be played and performed. The preternatural inertia beckoned me to the piano and sat me down in front of the keybed. The inky notes on the old paper seemed to drip down the page like rivulets of blood as I began to play. It was that same alien music that Relic played all those years before. The pyramids. At the end of the first measure, I felt a serenity come over me like 20 years of suppressed joy was released all at once. The music produced by my own hands once again sounded beautiful. Tears streamed from my eyes as I felt true happiness for the first time in decades. The massive weight of everything I'd ever cherished came crashing upon my psyche at that moment, and I'd never felt more love. It was an overwhelming rapture of supreme emotion. Soon I came to the end of the fourth measure. Still, I had exerted little or no mental intent to have moved at all since I awoke on the lawn. As the ultimate note and its sympathetic tones rang out, I watched in amazement as the keys appeared to liquefy beneath my hands. My hands themselves then took on a strange, hazy unreality. They appeared to be vibrating at an unfathomable speed, while at the same time they looked to embody complete stillness. Then, cutting through an intensifying white noise, I must have heard the vicious thumps of hundreds of more birds and creatures of the sky, seemingly making their fatal impact all over the house's exterior. Yet at that moment, I discovered that I couldn't care less for kamikaze birds. My hands had stolen my entire focus. I thought they might detach from my arms. The speed at which they soared and vibrated multiplied them endlessly, and the sight of my 1,000 hands was entrancing. Soon, the piano, the whole room in fact, swirled and churned in this vibrancy until everything within my field of vision became blurred and mashed like an oil painting. I felt absolutely nothing. Everything. Then, like a dream, the sound softly danced back into existence. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. It was the musical piece of all pieces, the mystical symphony, God.
10.
Then I found myself floating among an angel throng, blinded by their brilliance. They were all indescribable and disgusting, but unquestionably divine. The Almighty Creator loomed centered on a golden and gleaming throne. With outstretched suction cup tentacles, it sloofed over to me in a hideous fashion. It tightly embraced me with such sweetness that I felt I was a babe clutched close to his mother's breast. The god addressed me in a language that was the musical piece unleashed at the Z-Bar in 51. It was the unattainable music that came after Relic flawlessly played the pyramids. I wondered if fingers had been brought there on that night too, but just as soon as I thought it, I instantly knew he had not. The god informed me that all divine beings spoke in a language that primitively resembled what humans called music. It professed that all those who heard the speech of a god experienced their own unique musical motif. Even if the messages given were universally the same, all would hear something different. It informed me that the pyramids was less of a musical piece and more like an interdimensional key. I asked how such a key could have ever come into existence. Villainy, it sharply replied. Here I shall quote the god, but it is merely a translation. The sounds produced would more accurately be described as numerous sine waves of varying pitch, wavering just out and then back into perfect intervals, producing piercing vibrations that shook the energy of my being to its core. Still, never more clearly or more firmly has an idea been conveyed. At the dawn of time, said the god, there lived a black raven goddess named Asenath. She was an ancient. Restless and bored with immortality, Asenath resolved to concentrate and imprison her unending grief. She spent eons attempting to ensnare her melodious scream in a labyrinth ruled by meter and composed of both sound waves and silence, of things and nothings, ons and offs. She bound 14 fractions of her cawing scream into 14 great pyramids that were made of time itself. Through the goddess's divine meddling, it was one of those pyramids containing 1/14 of her godly wail that manifested in your reality as the musical piece, O Time, Thy Pyramids. I am sorry it made its way to you, my child. Such things are not meant to be. I stared up at my appalling creator with tears in my eyes. Its alien features broke like a doting father. It said, Fear not, my son. If you so desire, you shall return to that darkness no more. My heart swelled, and once again I was brought into the folds of the god's overwhelming embrace. I felt infinite sadness, infinite wonder, the worry of the infinite universe fade and fade, then shift into unbridled bliss eternal. William Herrick, the King.
Notable attendees at the Zanzibar, March 11, 1951. Info taken from Philadelphia PD and Pocono Summit PD annual reports, filed
December 17, 51, December 19, 57, December 15, 61, December 21, 71.
Milton Hazmat Hargraves, trumpeter for the Flagship, awarded Bop Player of the Year at 22 years old, 1949. leapt from the 19th floor of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel on Broad Street just 6 months after March 11th, 1951. Freddie Bronze Bozeman, drummer for Flagship, died from a heroin overdose on March 18, 1951, 1 week after hearing the piece at the Z-Bar. Charles Shrapnel Sharpton, respected bass player in the Philly scene, murdered his wife and newborn baby daughter with an ice pick before shooting himself in the head. It was 3 months to the day after the infamous night at the Z-Bar. Juan Hector Cookie Rojas, influential manager and booking agent in Philly, divorced his wife, abandoned his children, and cut all ties within 6 months of March 11th. He lived another 6 years until he died of stomach cancer in 57. Nadine Billy Flaps Nightingale, legendary jazz singer. On Halloween night 1961, Billy Flaps reportedly rode her horse, Ariel, off a cliff in the Pocono Mountains and fell to her death. She was found with fingers gouged into her arm with either a blade or her nails. Her horse was found nearly 70 yards away. Reports state that its left eye had been freshly plucked, and the stallion was viciously gelded just prior to death. William Willie the Air Candler Herritt VIII, pianist for Flagship, lived another 20 years after the events on March 11th, but never played piano publicly again. Found dead in his living room, sprawled out on his father's spinet piano. A hideous orgasmic expression was fixed on his long tortured face and forced his viewing to remain closed casket. This handwritten manuscript was discovered underneath his body, on the piano's keybed. Despite various events within this written work being proven true, no trace of any ancient sheet music or black hexagonal box was ever found. The police report states that there were, however, hundreds of dead falcons, ravens, and eagles strewn all throughout the Herritt property. Ellis Fingers Relic, not seen again in public after March 11, 1951. Cause of death, unknown.
Requis aeterna pro multis, fidelium egressus.